QSO Today episode 321, Bob Inderbitzen NQ1R. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. It's out. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. In the run-up to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, we got to know Kathleen Callahan, KC1MBY, and my guest today, Bob Inderbitzen, NQ1R, at the ARRL. Both were responsible for sanctioning the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo and helping it be noticed by ARRL members. We learned a lot from them about how to manage the communications to hams for this event, and by the numbers they were spot on. This week, my QSO Today is with Bob, who has a long history with ham radio, and hoping someday to work for the ARRL. He tells the rest of this story in this QSO Today. NQ1R, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Bob?
For Z1UG. Good morning, Eric. NQ1R. Nice to join you.
Thank you, Bob. It's nice to join you as well. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, thanks, Eric. You know, I started as a lifelong interested electronics enthusiast. So it starts even before my introduction to amateur radio. I was a kid who moved around a lot with his parents, his brother and sister, and we enjoyed a lot of personal time as siblings together, but also individually, because I didn't often have a lot of time to make deep friendships in the community or through school because we were often moving. My father was in the military and we moved a lot. So for me, the basement workshop where my father always set up shop was the place where I started to find an introduction to electronics. He was a Heathkit enthusiast, a builder, built lots of Heathkit things. And among those was a metal detector, and I watched him pore over each of those steps. He never got his amateur radio license, but there was a shortwave radio on the shelf, tube type, and that was my introduction to radio. But even before that, I remember playing with Tinker Toys, and the tin lids on those building blocks were opportunities to set them up and use a flashlight and move light around a space and see if I could wrap it around a corner. So there was a fascination there with the propagation of light and then later electronics in general. So right around 1982, I was living in Marlborough, New Jersey in middle school. I was 12 years old. And the vice principal of the middle school made an announcement over the intercom system, inviting anybody who wanted to learn a little bit about electronics and radio to come and explore ham radio and take a ham radio license class with the vice principal of the school. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. So I was a sixth grader, and that's what I ended up doing after school each day. And I think there was even opportunities during school, during free time. So I quickly got my ham radio license. The middle school vice principal was Steve Schifrinson, WB2URE. He's still a licensee out there. And he was extremely enthusiastic, and it seemed like it was coming from a place entirely different than school. He treated us like a young group of learners, but he was clearly wanting to share his love for amateur radio and electronics and radio. So I just went crazy for it. And the opportunity to spend some time in the vice principal's office after I got my license was the icing on the cake. The vice principal was often the disciplinarian in the school. So I got to be a fly on the wall, always pretending that my headphones were tuning me out of what was going on in the room. But I was keenly picking up on the dynamics between school staff and parent-student phone calls. It was quite a lot of fun. So I got my first ham radio license in '82. It was Kilo Alpha 2 Papa Zulu Delta. It was a novice class license, KA2PZD.
I remember middle school as well, and the vice principal had paddles hanging on the wall behind his desk. of various lengths. I think I was in middle school probably 12 years before you, and in those days they could actually hit kids. That's what I remember from my vice principal.
Yeah. I remember a sternness in the way that people could discipline. It was a public school, so things were, I don't remember it hitting anyone, but it was a really interesting experience. And but what the fun part was that right across from the vice principal's desk was a full-out ham radio station. It was only a small group of us.
You remember what he had?
Yeah, my introduction to a real ham radio transceiver was the Drake TR7A, and there was a tri-band beam antenna. And interestingly, your invitation to participate in the podcast today drew me to return to Marlboro, New Jersey last weekend. I hadn't been back there since I was in middle school. And I took a trip from Connecticut here down to Marlboro with the prime purpose of just visiting my old home, my old school. And when I got to the middle school, which looked very much unchanged except for an addition, there was the tri-bander antenna still on the roof. It was in poor condition, of course. It looked like it hadn't been used since I was there. All of the elements just drooping there. But there it was, just nestled in the middle of the roof on a short piece of tower, exactly as I left it a long time ago, 34 years ago.
So the novice license was your first license at KA2PZT?
Yeah, Kilo Alpha 2 Papa Zulu Delta, KA2PZD was my novice license. So that was and that puts you right onto the shortwave bands with the most entry level of licenses using Morse code. And so I think that was the magic of that license. You took the test. I believe at the time I took it with 2 volunteer examiners. It was a different system than the examining program today. They examined me, and it took a long time to wait for that envelope to come, indicating that I'd received my FCC license. And as soon as I did, I was in the vice principal's office every day, just poring over that radio and just having a great time. He used to order stuff from ARRL like world maps and logbooks, and we would be excited to see what new thing he introduced to the desk and the wall. Ham radio became my window to the world.
Now, did you end up having a ham radio station of your own?
Yeah, so so not long after that, I had a paper route. That was my way of making some money. And my father called me up one day and said, there's a TV repair shop in town here that has what I think is a ham radio on the shelf, an old one. It's a Heathkit. I got excited. It's all assembled, but it's just sitting there on the shelf, and it says $100. And I said, oh my gosh, $100. It's going to take me forever to make $100 on my paper route. So I started to bill people in advance without the newspaper company knowing, months in advance of when it was due, just inviting them to get a discount if they pay me up front for 4 or 5 months out of the newspaper. And I quickly got that $100, and my father took me down to the repair shop, and we bought the radio, and it reeked of cigarette smoke. And I started to research what to do with this stinky radio that had no manual. And the first thing was just to see if it worked. There was a power supply it was a Heathkit SB102 and the PS7 power supply. And I cobbled together that station with just some long wire just to see if the thing would work. And sure enough, it worked. But I was deeply afraid of the thing because I'd never owned a radio, and this was filled with tubes. So the first step was to figure out what to do with this thing. So I took all the tubes out, brought them to Radio Shack, which you could do at the time, tested all the tubes, identified the bad ones, bought tubes at Radio Shack to replace the bad ones. And then there's no internet. What to do there's no manual. I didn't know how to dip and adjust the plate of these tubes to transmit. So I wrote ARRL. And this was right around the time that my grandmother, who lived with us, my mom's mother, signed me up for ARRL membership as a 12-year-old. She thought that every kid should have a magazine. And so every Easter, she would renew my ARRL membership, which was only a couple dollars. It still is a good deal for youth living at home. But at the time, it was really inexpensive. But for me, it meant that I got 2 magazines at home throughout my middle school and high school years, Boys Life and QST Magazine. Well, I wrote ARRL a handwritten letter as a kid, and I told them all about this radio I got. And a couple days later, a manila envelope came in the mail from the league, and it included an entire photostat of the SB 102 assembly and instruction and operating manual. It was a big envelope, and there was a little piece of paper taped to the outside of the photostat because there weren't Post-its. I don't think we were using Post-its in 1982. And there was a little piece of paper that said, if your parents could send us a couple of dollars to cover the cost of this would be great. So somebody in the ARRL laboratory, and I later found out years later that the laboratory had a manual for every single radio that was pretty much widely produced in the marketplace. And that's what members did. They contacted the league for assistance when they bought used gear, and the laboratory would assist with connecting the dots with photocopies of manuals. And then I was on the air.
I interviewed somebody that used to work for Heathkit that used to write the manuals at Heathkit, and then I thought he went to the league. I'll put a reference in the show notes page, but it could be that you actually had the guy that actually wrote that manual working at the league at that time.
Well, I was one of those kids that then started to write the league all the time because as far as I was concerned, I had friends there as a member. There'd be a Disney movie on television that briefly mentioned ham radio in some way through some character, and I'd write a letter, Dear ARRL, Dear QST, I saw ham radio in a movie, and QST would pick these up. They published them in QST as what they called strays. And, I'd pore over the magazine looking for my name and call sign in there. And sure enough, there it was. The stray said, Disney does it again. And it was just a brief and signed by Bob Inderbitzen KA2PZD. And so, I had a really fun introduction to having a community of people who had my back in my early years of ham radio, and a lot of good people. When I moved on to high school, I moved on to a private high school in New Jersey. There wasn't a station there, but at that point, I'd found a ham radio operator in my neighborhood.
And did he become your mentor?
Yeah, Skip Graken, K3GNZ. And Skip lived in Englishtown, and I lived in Marlboro, New Jersey. He asked my parents if he could start to take me to the radio club meetings for the Raritan Bay radio amateurs. And that was my introduction to radio clubs. And so once a month, I would look forward to the car ride with Skip, and then the opportunity to meet a lot of other hams. And certainly the demographic was older, but I guess I had a blind eye to all of that. And just sort of was excited to be around people who enjoyed radio.
And I found, at least when I was a kid in an amateur radio club, that amateurs tended to treat us like adults. They related to us as amateurs, not as kids.
They really did.
That was your experience? Yeah,
I was always treated that way. And so that was the way I started to learn. I'd learn through others. I'd show up at the next meeting of the Raritan Bay radio amateurs, and some ham would hand me a crystal type FM transceiver, sort of portable, right? They had a strap on them. You'd hold it over your shoulder. It had a long whip antenna. Didn't work because that's why the guy gave it to me. And the goal was see if Bob can play with this thing. And I was terrible. I never really became an expert experimenter, but I enjoyed pulling stuff apart. And if it didn't work before, it really didn't work after I dove into it.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, it absolutely did. So my introduction to college was really poring over any information I could find that the college had a ham radio station. I mean, that was really my goal. I said it had to be an engineering school where I could be around these technical people and learn how to maybe fix this stuff or build this stuff or understand the technology and science behind it. And the college had to have a ham radio station. So I spent a lot of time on the air talking to hams, and made contact with a ham radio operator who was the trustee of the Worcester Polytechnic Institute Wireless Association. And he said, you absolutely have to come to WPI in Worcester, Mass. We have a great college club here. And so I filled out my handwritten college applications, Worcester Polytech, RPI, MIT, a number of them. I got into RPI and WPI and a local state school, and my parents agreed to send me to WPI, where I served as the radio club president for I think 3 full years. Never graduated from there, played much too much radio, determined I wasn't cut out for engineering, but did a whole lot of ham radio there. And it was a great and fantastic experience. The radio club was the WPI Wireless Association. And they told me if I was going to be the club president, I had to have my extra class license. So in the same spirit as all good college students, I crammed one night, went to a volunteer examination session, and upgraded in 1987 to extra class.
And that meant that at that time, you had to take the 20-word-a-minute CW test, right?
That's right. So Bob Taylor, who was a mechanical engineering technician at the campus and the trustee of the club, and the club is and was as dynamic as it's always been. It's a club that's among some of those really old amateur radio clubs from the founding of amateur radio, really. And Bob would invite me up at lunchtime to practice Morse code with him on the air. And that's really how I improved my Morse code to 20 words per minute was on air. And, WPI was my introduction to how to talk about amateur radio to the public. I used to run nets during hurricanes. The station was loud, and we did a lot of health and welfare traffic, hurricanes in the Yucatan Peninsula. And there's nothing better than a story about college students on a campus helping with a hurricane that's thousands of miles away. And so the press would come in, and I would enjoy talking to the press about what we were doing and the status of the storm and what we were hearing from people on the ground impacted by the hurricane. Later, the WPI students would fill the spaces for radio communication personnel at the Boston Marathon. So I got to do communications for public service year after year at the Boston Marathon. That was an exciting experience. One year I was positioned right at the finish line. College was really where I really started to grow in my appreciation for the various facets of amateur radio. But it's also where I started to realize that I needed to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I dropped out of college in 1990 and actually finished college through a program ARRL has and continues to have to this day for employees who want to get their degree. They had a continuing education program.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. So what was your first job out of WPA? Did you go right to the ARRL or did you go someplace else?
Yeah, I dropped out in 1990 and I substitute taught because back then no one really cared except if you're enthusiastic on what your background was for teaching. And I was a good touch typist and a good science and a good math enthusiast. So I would pick up these gigs where I would substitute teach in the public school system for 4 or 5 months while a teacher had a broken limb or out for a long medical leave. And I knew that wasn't going to last very long. So one day I flipped open the magazine. I started to apply everywhere. I applied for jobs at NASA and at Disney. And, the difficulty was I didn't have a college degree yet. But there was an opening in the volunteer examining department at ARRL in 1991. And the job opening reached the pages of QST. And I went in for the interview. My dad drove me. We were living in Connecticut at the time. He drove me an hour to ARRL headquarters. I got there 45 minutes too early and sat in a Friendly's with a knot in my stomach because they said, wow, what if I get a job at ARRL headquarters? This would be crazy. Sure enough, during the interview, they offered me the position. And I've been there for 29 years.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit about your on-the-air time. Are you a contester, DXer? What do you like to do on the air? What's your favorite operating mode?
My favorite thing is contests and casual operating and portable operating. And so I'll show up, although I often don't submit my logs formally. I'll often show up for an event. For Field Day, for instance, this last year, I set up for 2 days in a park in Connecticut and all by myself. I have an IC 7300 and a Alex loop antenna and a Bio-NO LiPo battery. Everything fits in a backpack, and I took it out to the park and brought a bunch of food and just had a blast operating Field Day this year from one of the state parks.
Did you do national parks on the air?
Yeah, I did some national parks. Sometimes I show up for sweepstakes. In the last couple of years, I've been trying to get involved more significantly in FT8 in the digital modes. So the station that I have right now in this modest Alex loop and the battery allows me to do some really fun weak signal stuff. And I'm just starting to get involved in that aspect of it. And I love dragging the radio out to Cape Cod. So just about every year for summer vacation, my husband, daughter, and I go to Provincetown, Massachusetts, and I'll usually disappear for 6 or 7 hours, go to Marconi Beach on Cape Cod, and I'll operate right there on the bluff. And the fun of it for me is talking to other people. So, you're set up at Marconi Beach on Cape Cod with your portable radio with all these placards about how Marconi made his transatlantic contacts from this location. And you can spend an entire afternoon talking to the general public about amateur radio and propagating signals. And I remember one guy saying, "Hey, excuse me, professor, can I ask you what you're doing here at Marconi Beach?" And that's just great fun. I eat that stuff up.
So do you have collateral that you give out to the public when you're operating out in the public, operating portable? Do you have like QSL cards or some kind of a card or something that you can give to people in order to allow them to follow up?
Yeah, a lot of times first of all, I'll give them my business card and I'll tell them I work at the National Association for Amateur Radio in the United States. I'll tell that story. It has my the ARRL web address on it. I'll invite them to click on the What is Ham Radio link. I'll ask them to reach out to me if they need help. I usually tell them what to study from, to look for a club. So I'll usually direct them to some resources. And as for collateral, I might bring a flyer with me. ARRL has a flyer called What is Ham Radio. It gets updated every couple of years, but it's just so somebody has some takeaway when you think it's the right thing to have. I find that if you can really hook somebody and give them your business card, that sometimes does more than loading somebody up with a table full of paperwork.
I like giving out even to non-hams QSL cards, because they're unusual. Who sees postcards anymore?
Absolutely, and that's my business card. QSL cards are my business card, and that's great fun to just hand those out and then tell a little bit of the story of QSLing as well. But even that's a hard, somebody who doesn't know anything about radio. I usually focus on radio communications, and I'm looking for that starry-eyed person who maybe hasn't even heard about ham radio, but just says, "Wow, look at all that equipment. This is cool," and really start to develop that.
Do you have any sense of the people that you've met on the beach that actually have gone forward and maybe explored amateur radio and even gotten their license?
Well, I definitely heard from people following those connections where they'll follow up and drop me a note, and they'll say, I'm trying to make a decision between this one and this one for a study thing, or I tried this particular radio club and sort of hit a dead end. And my response to anybody who usually hits a dead end is to go right up the ARRL field organization food chain and start with somebody like an ARRL section manager who knows their section community and can say, you know what, I'm going to introduce you to this ham in your community. And so I've done a lot of that over the years. I've connected the dots so that somebody who really is demonstrates sort of an interest in taking this to the next level finds somebody in their community to help them. That's really key. I spend a lot of time with colleges and universities through the ARRL Collegiate Amateur Radio Initiative. And once a month, we have a teleconference with student leaders from radio clubs at universities across the country. A lot of this happens under the radar without many ham radio operators even knowing that there's such a dynamic community among college radio clubs. But ARRL's role, and my role specifically, has been to create a space for them to network with each other. And so they're constantly seeing people graduate, leave the school, and the need to replenish that club to sustain the club. And so they need a very fast pathway into the radio club. And so the stories I usually hear from college students are very much the same. Let's connect them with a mentoring opportunity within the radio club. Let's handhold. Let's throw a radio at them. Let's get them licensed, but let's take it to the next level. And so there's this community component in college radio clubs that's absolutely required to sustain the small numbers of most campus radio clubs. I wish actually more tried and true radio clubs and communities would use the same method. Our radio clubs sometimes tend to focus too closely on the business of being a club and less on the idea of developing new radio amateurs to become active learners and active members of the ham radio community. So I've connected the dots a lot, Eric, over the years, really just ensuring that, one, I think I've gotten good at identifying somebody who's interested in amateur radio or could be a good candidate for it. And then two, to identify where the strengths are in our amateur radio community to set somebody on the fast pathway to getting their license. I wish there was a silver or golden arrow that grew amateur radio twice as big as it is or 3 times as big as it is. But as I found out studying amateur radio for so many years and poring over QST, there isn't. We're a niche service, a niche avocation. I never beat myself up over amateur radio growth in terms of just numbers, but I do think there's a huge opportunity to do something better with the 30,000 new licensees in the United States that come to us every year to set them on that path of mentoring, radio club, activity, learning. That's something that we can concentrate on, and we grow amateur radio quite significantly, working even within the community that's dealt us.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Well, I've been an ARRL member on and off since almost 48 years. So you're saying something that's very interesting to me for the first time, and that is that ARRL has section managers. It has people in every area of the country, and I didn't think of it until you mentioned it, that would know their local radio clubs and the personalities and the kind of clubs that they are, and what an amazing resource that could be for a new ham, or even a ham that wants to do something different, a different spin on amateur radio. I think that's very important, that maybe ARRL members, and even people who are not ARRL members, should know who those section managers are and use them as a resource.
Yeah, I think when someone becomes a section manager, their contact information is extremely published through the ARRL website and QST magazine, because these are, there's sort of these three components to ARRL in terms of people. We have a staff, we have a board of directors, and that really, those two elements really comprise the nonprofit association. And then we have all the things that ARRL does, and the most significant extension of that work is member volunteers, and that's manifest in something we call the ARRL field organization. Sometimes members and outsiders might perceive the ARRL board and section managers as one and the same, but they're really not. The ARRL board of directors meets twice a year, and they have a lot of committees, and they're strategic, and they do incredibly good work as volunteers. But the section managers are extensions of ARRL programs and services. You can think of it as scout troops and all the scout leaders in scouting who really know the pulse and heartbeat of their own communities in terms of their service. And so, we have the ARRL section managers, and section managers nurture other volunteers in their community to help extend their effectiveness. And their reporting line is really right back to ARRL headquarters. It's not a governance-related item. They are elected, but they're extremely effective volunteers who extend the effectiveness of the organization in a very personal way. And so I tend to think that they know what's going on in the amateur radio community, and the volunteers working within the field organization with them who have specialties. It might be education. It might be technical specialties. You'll often see titles like assistant section manager for technology, or assistant section manager for youth, or section emergency coordinator. SECs are the heartbeat of the ARRL Amateur Radio Emergency Service. They know what's going on from a public service and emergency communications perspective in their community. So, a newcomer comes into amateur radio wanting to save the world. They've heard that amateur radio is extremely effective during communications in communities where commercial infrastructure is damaged, and ham radio operators set up that final mile, maybe between a police station and a hospital, or whatever ham radio operators are doing to make up the commercial emergency communications grid. So hams do that, and outsiders say, I want to do that too. And so they join a local radio club, and they find out that maybe that radio club isn't particularly plugged into public service. Well, the role of ARRL is, let's plug them in. So let's identify when they're interested in public service. Let's put them in touch with their SM. Let's put them in touch with their SEC, their section emergency coordinator. And then these people can then plug them into local training and the local community. So sometimes connecting the dots is only one or two steps, but it's if you're new, I think it's daunting. Somebody from my perspective, I just love the idea that in one or two connections, we can plug somebody into amateur radio more deliberately.
As an ARRL employee for 29 years, and as a ham radio operator, does working for the ARRL have the same appeal as a Disneyland fan would have working for the Magic Kingdom?
It does. It really does. And I'll tell you where some of that is. There's the rote work. My field at ARRL is product development. So, I'm constantly weaving a thread among departments so that ARRL functions in a way where everybody knows, all the staff know what we're working on, and helping each other with our own particular areas. And product development means developing programs and services and products to benefit our members. And so the fun for me is that it's, first of all, in my avocation, in my hobby, in the service that I care so deeply about. But the other part of it is the people that I've met. Oh my gosh, for my first date in Hamvention was also the first year I started working at ARRL. And through my involvement in the amateur radio convention community, I've come to really get to know an incredible number of radio amateurs around the world. So, I get to do something that not every radio amateur gets to do. I get to put a face behind the name and call sign of these people that we talk to on the air all the time. And there are incredible stories in this community, people whose lives, irrespective of their interest in amateur radio, get woven into their story. And, I like to tell a story of meeting ham radio operators in Germany during the big ham radio convention that's held there each year, and how a French ham radio operator, part of that greatest generation, walked by the U.S. flag that we were having waving in the booth, and touched his fingers to his lips and then to the flag and walked by. And I said, wow, what a gift this is to work for an organization where I get to represent both the avocation I love, but also my country. This is a service. Each of our national societies foster amateur radio for the benefit of our nation as well. And that's just been great fun to sort of wrap myself in that part of ARRL.
I interviewed Ellen White, W1YL, some years ago. We've been doing this for more than 6 years. Ellen told me at that time when she worked for the ARRL that you tend to go through a lot of different jobs the longer you're there. What jobs have you done at the ARRL that led you to product development?
So in 1991, I started there in the volunteer examining department. And so some of the fun that I had working for the VEC was going into the field and talking to volunteer examiners during a particularly brisk time in the community, where we were really building this incredibly large community of volunteer examiners. And we wanted to become more efficient in the volume. So I would meet, for instance, in Boston with 100 volunteer examiners and run sessions talking about how we can most effectively process amateur radio licensing administration and testing in the field, and what they could do to help the organization as well to make that, and listen to the feedback and shape the program. This was around the time, and if you're a volunteer examiner, you'll know this. This was a time when I looked for opportunities also to pull other people from my story in amateur radio into ARRL. And so, we wanted grading of VE tests to be more efficient. So I went to WPI, and I went to, as a staff member at ARRL, and I went to that trustee of the radio club, and I said, Bob, you run a big metal shop here at the campus. This was Bob Taylor, NA1Q. Can you develop something with acetate to create plastic templates that our volunteer examiners can grade exams with? And that was really the start of the ARRL VEs using these blue pieces of acetate to grade papers. And the WPI students loved the idea that they were helping produce this material for the ARRL VE program. So the VEC was a place where I started, and then I quickly moved into the Educational Activities Department around 1993. And my role there was to represent ARRL in a booth each year that was purchased or donated to us by NASA to demonstrate or show off the shuttle amateur radio experiment. And I worked with Rosalie White, who was the department manager of the ARRL Educational Activities Department at that time. Rosalie today, of course, is a significant part of the amateur radio on the International Space Station team. But at the time, she was running the Educational Activities Department, which was responsible for the ARRL's relationship with AMSAT and NASA for the shuttle amateur radio experiment. So I'd get invited as a 20-something-year-old eager young ham working for the ARRL to operate a booth next to the Hubble Space Telescope to show off the shuttle amateur radio experiment and find teachers at science fairs or science conventions who might be interested in bringing amateur radio into their classroom through that program.
Were you involved in the Teachers Institute at the ARRL, and could you explain what that is?
I wasn't, but the program was developed after I was in that area of the organization. But the Teachers Institutes is part of ARRL's charitable function, which is to introduce more of the general public to radio and radio communications using amateur radio as our breadboard. And so the Teachers Institutes, which are funded by members and other donors, including the industry, we receive donations to operate these classrooms. Usually they're at ARRL headquarters in Connecticut. The Dayton Amateur Radio Association in Dayton, Ohio, has a space where they host these classes. We bring in an amateur radio educator, somebody with a very significant background also in elementary school education and secondary education. And the instructor leads them through a very intense run teachers through this very intense program where we introduce them to radio communications through electronics, through robotics, through all different types of buoys and beacons and balloons and lots of different ways to introduce teachers to radio communications and what we call wireless communications literacy or wireless technology literacy. And then we hope that they take it into, the whole goal is that these educators bring these new skills into their classroom. And they always walk away with an appreciation of not how we can mine lots and lots of new kids into amateur radio, but how we can use amateur radio as a breadboard for helping young people discover radio communications, electronics. Let's face it, everything electronic is more fun, more interesting, has higher utility when it's wireless. And there's no shortage of wireless in the world. So the Teachers Institutes ensure that there's a next generation of young people who get the right foundation in what wireless technology is. Teachers don't pay for any of that. Their travel, their attendance is all covered by the Teachers Institute funding.
Do you have any stats on the success of the Teachers Institute with regard to maybe not making more hams, although it seems to me that would be great, in terms of what its success is in terms of turning kids into technologists or bringing them into STEM?
I don't have my fingertips, but I know that people at ARRL who are closest to this work on those things all the time because we're looking at grant funding and we're looking at justification to our donors. So I know that you'll sometimes see scholarship winners of various amateur radio scholarships who have come through some of the programs led by school teachers in amateur radio. So no, my perspective is mostly anecdotal, but there's so much of it that's anecdotal that it's incredible to hear the stories of so many young people who choose careers in amateur radio, who choose careers because of their foundation in amateur radio or their introduction to the amateur radio on the International Space Station program, or because of a teacher who taught technology through the use of amateur radio in the classroom. I mean, those stories are just so prevalent. But no, I don't have at my fingertips sort of the metrics of that. We should, and I think we do.
What do you think is the most exciting ARRL initiative right now?
Learning. So we're trying to change the vocabulary right now, and I model this a lot as a mouthpiece for product development. We're trying to change the narrative. We're all hyper-focused for the last 30 years in amateur radio on licensing, but I think we have it flipped around the wrong way. I think the focus should be on developing people who are introduced to our hobby, to our service as learners. And so most of the initiatives that ARRL is focused on right now create pathways or create journeys for people who come into amateur radio to be lifelong learners. Again, I mentioned that 30,000 new licensees come into amateur radio almost without fail in the United States. That's been a number that's been very constant for the last years. And only a fraction of them we know from surveys and from studies that ARRL's conducted become active in amateur radio. And the reasons are for a lot of the reasons I mentioned: a lack of mentoring, weak clubs in their community, a complicated service that doesn't have clear pathways for people to get involved in what drew them to amateur radio. And so two specific initiatives that get me really excited right now are one that was introduced in July, and that's the ARRL Learning Network. The Learning Network is now a member-based webinar series where every month ARRL sponsors member volunteers who tell or share some part of their experience in amateur radio with the interest of developing more people in that interest. So we've had people present on portable operating. We've had hams present on wire antennas. We'll have one coming up here by Glenn Popeil on microcontrollers, how to get started in amateur radio microcontrollers. So this will be something that will sustain all year long, not unlike the experience that hams have at in-person Hamfest through forums, or not unlike the experience that they had at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, but something that's often will be offered on a regular basis. I guess we want hams to not have to comb the internet to find good programming in amateur radio. So the second part of that learning network is the Future ARRL Learning Center, which is an online course hub, which will be available for all members to dive into both synchronous and asynchronous course programming on their interest in amateur radio. And I think we've divvied that up into technology, personal operating, and public service, emergency communications and public service. So technology, operating, and personal communications. I say operating, it's a really vague area, but there's a ton of people who come into amateur radio because amateur radio, again, provides a breadboard to radio communications. And for the last couple of years, I've spent time at the EAA Air Venture Air Show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. It was canceled because of COVID for 2020, in the in-person event. But since 2018, ARRL is exhibited at the air show. And the first thing we learned in 2018 and 2019 is that there's thousands of pilots who have their amateur radio license. And when you start to talk to them about why they got their amateur radio license, it's for two things: their affinity with learning technical things. So their pilots are lifelong learners. There's no way to be a pilot unless you become a lifelong learner. And the second part of it is amateur radio provides that breadboard for talking on a radio that you do so infrequently as a pilot that it provides a regular opportunity to hone those skills. I've spoken to a lot of new pilots who have said the most intimidating thing getting your pilot license is talking to the air traffic control tower, but it's not so for me as a ham radio operator and pilot. So some of my fun also to develop these new initiatives that are focused on a journey of learning has been being a physical presence with amateur radio conventions and trade shows, whether those are online experiences or in-person experiences. And so a lot of the ham radio community who knows me from probably seeing me at Dayton Hamvention, Orlando Hamcation, the big ham radio convention in Germany. And what we're really trying to do by being in those places is to figure out what's effective in helping ham radio operators learn. And then we go beyond the amateur radio community, and I'm spending time with organizations like the Civil Air Patrol, Scouts, aviation enthusiasts. These are all communities with some like-minded overlapping interests where there's a synergy in using amateur radio as a breadboard for discovering radio communications. So again, you'll hear me say that over and over and over again. We're not out there in the world looking for ham radio operators. We're out there introducing people to radio communications, and the pathway of doing that is through the amateur radio community.
The COVID-19 pandemic has taken ham radio clubs online. Do you think that it's kind of knocked down the boundaries for new hams to be able to find groups of people in amateur radio that might serve their interests?
I'm not convinced that even COVID and all of the great storytelling that amateur radio has had in the public media about being the original communicators, of being able to weather social distancing because ham radios by their nature social distance. Again, I don't think there's a multiplying effect of that for amateur radio. However, I do think the amateur radio community has learned in increasing ways how to better utilize the type of communication and tools that we use maybe at work, that we're using to stay connected with our families, to expand the ways we engage with the amateur radio community. I'll go back to the university setting. Okay, so right now we have all of these active amateur radio college campus radio clubs around the United States. There's actually hundreds of them. If you visit www.arrl.org/we want you, as in we want universities, we want you uniform. If you visit that website, you'll find a link there to college radio clubs, a database of them, an Excel listing of them. There's a lot of them, and there's new ones coming on board all the time. But guess what? This COVID period, there's a ton of schools that can't utilize the in-person station on campus this year. Most students are operating in some sort of remote or hybrid remote way for their studies. And yet the college radio clubs are sort of in a renaissance right now. They're holding their club meetings using Skype and Zoom, but they quickly moved to how do we remote enable our campus radio clubs, or watching students like the Cal Poly students who now have a fully remote station, and they're sharing how to do that with other college radio clubs around the country. They've presented on how to set up remote at the stations, and they're all those Baofeng radios and inexpensive handhelds that these universities have been handed out to their student members to take home with them so they can get on the repeater. And the college clubs are running nets on the air. And they're running nets because they want to familiarize a ton of new licensees in their radio clubs on just how to talk on the air. So the nets are fun. They're not business nets, and they're not high traffic moving nets. They're having gripe nets where they get together on the air and they talk about their professors and their classes, and they're passing the mic around, and they're learning how to talk on the air. And then some of them are moving their nets to HF so that some element of their student community can get their upgrade their ham radio license and get a taste of what HF is like. So it's how to pull it all together, how to utilize all of this COVID technology that we're being reintroduced to and utilizing at a higher level to make us more effective in developing community for amateur radio. And I think students are a perfect way to see how they're doing that. Everybody has fatigue right now from being on webinars and Skype. So there has to be a reason that makes your heart sing to want to be on it. And one way is to continue to be connected with your peers. And so clubs, whether they're student clubs or community amateur radio clubs, who are effectively using these tools are growing amateur radio, are creating more lifelong learners, are mentoring.
It seems to me that DMR talk groups, for example, for radio clubs, so if you're social distancing from your school and you're 1,000 miles away or across the country, across the world, that your college DMR talk group could be a place where you could hang out, having a portable and a hotspot.
Yeah, that's 100%. I still follow the reflector of the Worcester Polytechnic Institute radio club, and when they meet on the air in a repeater way, it almost always involves one of these internet-connected repeater systems, so that the students who are outside of the community still at home can participate as well. So yes, most certainly.
If amateur radio is the national park of the airwaves, as some of my previous guests have described it, do you see that ARRL are its rangers?
Yeah, I mean, we're facilitators. We want a large number of the general public to be introduced to their freedom to utilize the radio airwaves. And so this incredible spectrum has been granted to us with some requirements, right? So if you look at the fundamental purpose of the amateur radio service from the FCC rules standpoint, there's a fundamental purpose why we exist, to develop a reservoir of trained radio electronics experts, to communicate across boundaries because radio's waves know no boundaries. So to be representatives of our own countries, to ensure that there's an established emergency communications network in our communities. These all come directly out of the FCC rules. But the purpose of an association all the time, like ARRL, in our respective areas is to nurture and grow and train and connect and create community. So we're not, we're rangers in the same way that a park ranger might say, welcome to this state park or national park. Here are some ways that you can most effectively enjoy and utilize this park. Let me tell you some of the hidden things that you don't know about this park. Let me introduce you to some of the people who know this space better than I do. I think that that's our role.
Why should amateur radio operators belong to the ARRL?
I'll come back to association. It's that three-legged stool of a nonprofit organization. You want to affiliate with others who share your interest. You want the protection and the voice of a community en masse. So when people join ARRL is more effective in ensuring that there's advocacy for the incredible spectrum that's been granted to the amateur radio service as that test bed and breadboard for our amateur radio service. There is incredible benefit to the individual member to find their area and connect with other members with their interest in amateur radio. There's incredible efficiency in an association. There's there's a big front window to the car and a small back window. And an association that does it right will be able to tell you where we came from and why, but where we're going. And so ARRL is the centerpiece of curating and advancing the stories and interest in our amateur radio service. I love all of the incredible storytelling that members are doing right now through your podcast, or the technical and public service aspects of volunteering through the ARRL Learning Network. And you find that by joining an association. So, I'll go back to my very first parts of this podcast where I shared my story as a young ham wanting to get involved in the amateur radio service. And the community seemed really small until I started to engage with ARRL, and I found that there were so many awesome people and experiences to dive into. So at a nutshell, for the organization, it's yes, it's a membership organization, but there's a charitable part, an outreach part of introducing others to radio communications and finding the best and most effective ways to do that. Advocacy. Those are probably the key areas of why you'd want to be a member of the ARRL.
Well, as an American licensee and an Israeli licensee, I'm a Diamond Club member of the ARRL and have been for a number of years. So I think that even if you don't live in the United States, that the ARRL is an organization that has a lot of resources that are worth tapping into for the nominal price that it costs to be a supporter of the ARRL. What advice do you have for new or returning hams to the hobby?
Yes, it's find your place quickly in the service. So if you come in interested in saving the world because somebody told you that getting your ham radio license is a great way to serve your community, then like any avocation, you need to roll up your sleeves and dive in somewhere. Now, there's a responsibility in the amateur radio community to provide that training, to provide that experience. But I think that that's clearer today than ever. So I usually encourage a new ham to join ARRL, start to find amateur radio in their own community, and to start to find opportunities to learn and to train and to experience. I'm a bit biased. I think that a lot of new hams should run out and establish a first station. And I don't, sure, get a handheld radio, but get an HF radio too. And you can do that in a modest way today through the used amateur radio market or through the new amateur radio market. The cost of radios is well in reach of a lot of members of our community and new members of our community these days. And because a lot of the radios function in portable ways, it's very exciting for people who maybe are confined to a community with restrictive covenants, or you live in an apartment like I do. I say go out and get that HF radio. Go out and build your first wire antenna. Doing that is extremely easy, but it'll also help you overcome that initial hurdle of understanding about the incredible technology that we have to propagate signals. And HF is a perfect way to be introduced to that. If we look at the pathway of even the most narrow interested amateur radio operators who say, I'm just going to get a technician license so that I can get a handheld radio and talk on local repeaters and hike, and they'll make it really easy. We tend to find that they stay less involved in amateur radio than somebody who also experiences some of the broader parts of amateur radio spectrum, including HF. And because you can do things like HF digital, there's even more ways to experience HF operating today. But if we look time and time again at the most active members of our amateur radio community, including newcomers, it's those who get their technician license, upgrade quickly to general, later upgrade to extra, get on HF, get a handheld radio, and dive into their corner of amateur radio that they're interested in. So explore it all, but once you find your pathway, start to take advantage of some of the incredible resources the community has to learn and train.
I think one of the opportunities that we have in 2020 is that the proliferation of radios since the 70s, from the manufacturers like ICOM and Yaesu and Kenwood and through the numbers, is that there's a great many amateurs all over the world, but in North America, who are active in ham clubs that have lots of this gear in their basements, in their attics, on their desk, not under their desk, under their desk. And so if you belong to an amateur radio club, you might find a mentor that will say, take this for $100 or take it for free. Just get it out of my house and I'll help you make it work. And so you could get that 100 watts in a wire probably relatively inexpensively with a great Elmer to help you get that on the air. What do you think of that?
Yes. And so get that relatively inexpensive, or find where the used and surplus gear are in your communities. Developing a relationship with a radio club is a super way to find out where there's some radios that you can get your hands on at a relatively low cost, because there's experienced members of the community who are always upgrading their stations and buying the latest and greatest and recycling the used stuff into the community. But so connect with a local radio club to do that. Find out where the college radio clubs are in your community. A lot of them, like the University of Arizona in Tucson, which has a radio club, extends their relationship beyond just the campus. So beyond just their student membership. So they have a relationship with other ham radio operators in the nearby community, and they're able to share their resources of their campus experience and their campus station with the community that way. And there's nothing more exciting than starting to imagine that amateur radio is part of a Tucson community instead of just a small club in a corner somewhere. Plugged in with both the public service aspects of that community, the university in that community, the students in that community. It's a really exciting model.
Bob, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was really great to meet you, as we did when we were working on the expo, and I'm so glad that you're able to share your story on QSO Today.
Eric, thanks very much. It's good to meet you, and looking forward to hearing from future interviewees on your podcast.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bob. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in NQ1R in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.